The morning arrived the way most mornings did, quietly, without asking for permission to be remembered. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows of the school building, settling gently across polished floors that still carried the faint echo of yesterday's footsteps. Lockers stood in neat rows, dented and scratched in places, holding the private lives of hundreds of students behind thin metal doors. Somewhere down the hall, a bell rang, not sharp or urgent, just firm enough to signal that the day had begun. In classrooms across the building, teachers straightened papers, adjusted chairs, and prepared for lessons they had taught dozens of times before. There was comfort in repetition. Predictability had a way of making people feel in control. Room 214 was no different. The desks were arranged in clean lines, each one facing the front where a whiteboard stretched across the wall. Faded posters clung to the corners, motivational quotes, historical timelines, reminders about effort and discipline. The room smelled faintly of dry erase markers and floor cleaner, a scent that never quite went away no matter how many windows were opened. Students filtered in slowly, backpacks slung over shoulders, conversations murmuring in low waves. Some laughed, some stared at their phones. Some moved quietly, careful not to draw attention to themselves. By the time the bell rang again, the room had settled into that familiar stillness that comes just before learning or before something else entirely. Near the middle of the room sat a black student named Marcus. He had arrived early, as he usually did, not because he was eager to be noticed, but because being early allowed him to choose his seat, arrange his notebook, and breathe before the room filled with noise. There was comfort in small routines, comfort in knowing where to sit, where to look, how to move without disrupting the fragile balance of the day. Marcus wasn't the kind of student teachers worried about. He completed his work. He listened. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. His grades were steady, his behavior unremarkable. In many ways, he was invisible in the safest sense of the word. And that invisibility had taught him something important. Silence could be a form of protection. He sat upright, shoulders relaxed, pen resting between his fingers. From the outside, there was nothing unusual about him, just another student in another classroom on another ordinary morning. But like most people, Marcus carried a quiet awareness of the room around him, who held power, who spoke freely, and who was expected to listen. At the front of the room stood Mr. Harris. He was already there when the students arrived, his jacket draped neatly over the back of his chair, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest authority mixed with approachability. He was a teacher who believed in control. Not loud control, not dramatic control, but the kind that came from posture, tone, and expectation. When Mr. Harris spoke, people listened, not because he raised his voice, but because he rarely needed to. He had been teaching for years, long enough to feel certain about the kind of person he was in the classroom. Fair, observant, experienced. He prided himself on being able to read students quickly, to understand who needed discipline, who needed encouragement, and who needed to be pushed harder. The class began without incident. Mr. Harris reviewed the lesson plan, his voice steady as he wrote key points on the board. The marker squeaked softly with each movement. Students followed along, flipping pages, copying notes. Time moved forward in predictable increments, sentences written, heads nodding, minutes passing. Marcus focused on his notebook, writing carefully, neatly. He had learned that doing things well, quietly, often kept questions away, and questions, he knew, could sometimes lead to assumptions. Around him, the classroom hummed with low energy. A chair scraped against the floor. Someone coughed. A pencil rolled and was quickly retrieved. Nothing stood out. Nothing felt dangerous. And yet, beneath the surface, there was a subtle tension Marcus had grown to recognizing. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was awareness, the kind that comes from knowing that in certain spaces you are more visible than you appear and less understood than anyone realizes. Mr. Harris paused mid-sentence and scanned the room, his eyes moving from desk to desk. It was a habit of his, one he believed demonstrated engagement. His gaze lingered briefly on Marcus, then moved on. There was no expression, no judgment, just a look, quickly forgotten. Marcus noticed it anyway. He always did. The lesson continued. A discussion question was posed. A few students raised their hands, eager to speak. Others avoided eye contact, hoping the moment would pass without calling on them. Mr. Harris selected a student near the front, nodding in approval as they answered. Everything about the moment felt ordinary, and that was the point. Because moments that change people rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with warning signs or raised voices. They slip into places that feel safe, disguised as routine. Marcus shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his notebook. His phone buzzed quietly in his backpack, a vibration he ignored. He already knew what it was, a message from home, sent earlier than usual. He didn't open it. There would be time later. Mr. Harris turned back to the board, continuing his explanation. His tone was casual now, almost conversational, the kind of tone teachers use when they believe the room belongs to them completely. As he spoke, he made a small comment, an aside really, about responsibility, about family expectations, about how support systems shape student success. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular. It wasn't even unkind on the surface. But Marcus felt something tighten just slightly in his chest. Because he had learned that casual comments could carry weight, that general statements sometimes landed differently depending on who was listening. He kept his eyes on the page. The clock ticked forward second by second. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees lining the school grounds. Somewhere beyond the walls of the classroom, the world continued on, unaware of how fragile moments could be. Mr. Harris finished his thought and smiled faintly, satisfied. The class remained quiet, attentive. On the surface, nothing had changed. But beneath that calm, something subtle had begun to form. A line had been drawn, not visibly, not intentionally, but once drawn, it would not stay unnoticed for long. And as the morning continued, no one in room 214 could have predicted how quickly the ordinary would give way to something unforgettable. Not yet. For now, it was just another class, just another student, just another teacher, and a moment that hadn't happened yet, but was already on its way.
By the time the first bell faded into memory, the classroom had settled into a rhythm that felt familiar to everyone inside it. Lessons moved forward, pages turned, pens scratched softly against paper. From the outside, room 214 looked like any other classroom in any other school, orderly, structured, controlled. It was a place built on rules and expectations, on the idea that everyone inside it was equal so long as they followed the same instructions. But Marcus had learned, slowly and without anyone ever explaining it to him, that equality in a room didn't always feel the same from every seat. He listened carefully as Mr. Harris spoke, absorbing the material the way he always did, not passively, but attentively. Marcus liked understanding things. Facts made sense. Rules made sense. They were clean, predictable. People, on the other hand, were more complicated. As the lesson moved forward, Mr. Harris shifted into discussion mode. He enjoyed this part of teaching. It allowed him to see who was engaged, who was confident, who needed guidance. He asked questions that invited opinions, observations, interpretations. A few familiar voices answered. Marcus did not raise his hand. It wasn't that he didn't know the answers. Often he did. But experience had taught him something valuable. Speaking up changed how people looked at you. Sometimes it invited respect, other times it invited scrutiny,
And scrutiny, Marcus knew, had a way of sliding into places it didn't belong. So he listened. From time to time, his thoughts drifted, never far, just enough to brush against memories of home. Home was quieter than people expected. Not lonely, not broken, just intentional. His father wasn't around much, at least not in the way teachers like to imagine fathers. There were no pickup trucks waiting after school, no loud cheers from the bleachers, no casual appearances at parent nights. But absence didn't mean emptiness. Marcus had grown up understanding that love didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived in early morning messages. Sometimes it showed up in discipline, in standards, in expectations that didn't bend just because things were hard. His father believed in preparation, in structure, in being ready for moments before they arrived. Those lessons weren't written down anywhere. They weren't visible on report cards or attendance sheets, but Marcus carried them with him, quietly, every day. At school, though, people tended to fill in gaps with assumptions. When classmates talked about their parents, Marcus usually listened more than he spoke, not because he was ashamed, but because explaining took effort, and effort invited curiosity, and curiosity sometimes turned into judgment. Teachers asked questions too, mostly harmless ones. Who helps you with homework? Will your parents be able to attend the event? Can someone at home sign this? Marcus always answered politely, briefly, carefully. Yes. I'll check. I'll bring it back. Over time, he had learned how to exist within the margins of those conversations, present but not exposed. But Mr. Harris was the kind of teacher who liked context. He believed that understanding a student's background helped him teach better. And while that belief came from a place of professionalism, it sometimes led to conclusions he didn't realize he was making. As the lesson moved forward, Mr. Harris shifted into discussion mode. He enjoyed this part of teaching. It allowed him to see who was engaged, who was confident, who needed guidance. He asked questions that invited opinions, observations, interpretations. A few familiar voices answered. Marcus did not raise his hand. It wasn't that he didn't know the answers. Often he did, but experience had taught him something valuable. Speaking up changed how people looked at you. Sometimes it invited respect, other times it invited scrutiny. And scrutiny, Marcus knew, had a way of sliding into places it didn't belong. So he listened. From time to time, his thoughts drifted, never far, just enough to brush against memories of home. Home was quieter than people expected. Not lonely, not broken, just intentional. His father wasn't around much, at least not in the way teachers like to imagine fathers. There were no pickup trucks waiting after school, no loud cheers from the bleachers, no casual appearances at parent nights. But absence didn't mean emptiness. Marcus had grown up understanding that love didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived in early morning messages. Sometimes it showed up in discipline, in standards, in expectations that didn't bend just because things were hard. His father believed in preparation, in structure, in being ready for moments before they arrived. Those lessons weren't written down anywhere. They weren't visible on report cards or attendance sheets, but Marcus carried them with him, quietly, every day. At school, though, people tended to fill in gaps with assumptions. When classmates talked about their parents, Marcus usually listened more than he spoke, not because he was ashamed, but because explaining took effort, and effort invited curiosity, and curiosity sometimes turned into judgment. Teachers asked questions too, mostly harmless ones. Who helps you with homework? Will your parents be able to attend the event? Can someone at home sign this? Marcus always answered politely, briefly, carefully. Yes. I'll check. I'll bring it back. Over time, he had learned how to exist within the margins of those conversations, present but not exposed. But Mr. Harris was the kind of teacher who liked context. He believed that understanding a student's background helped him teach better. And while that belief came from a place of professionalism, it sometimes led to conclusions he didn't realize he was making. As the lesson moved forward, Mr. Harris shifted into discussion mode. He enjoyed this part of teaching. It allowed him to see who was engaged, who was confident, who needed guidance. He asked questions that invited opinions, observations, interpretations. A few familiar voices answered. Marcus did not raise his hand. It wasn't that he didn't know the answers. Often he did, but experience had taught him something valuable. Speaking up changed how people looked at you. Sometimes it invited respect, other times it invited scrutiny. And scrutiny, Marcus knew, had a way of sliding into places it didn't belong. So he listened. From time to time his thoughts drifted, never far, just enough to brush against memories of home. Home was quieter than people expected. Not lonely, not broken, just intentional. His father wasn't around much, at least not in the way teachers like to imagine fathers. There were no pickup trucks waiting after school, no loud cheers from the bleachers, no casual appearances at parent nights. But absence didn't mean emptiness. Marcus had grown up understanding that love didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived in early morning messages. Sometimes it showed up in discipline, in standards, in expectations that didn't bend just because things were hard. His father believed in preparation, in structure, in being ready for moments before they arrived. Those lessons weren't written down anywhere. They weren't visible on report cards or attendance sheets. But Marcus carried them with him, quietly, every day. At school, though, people tended to fill in gaps with assumptions. When classmates talked about their parents, Marcus usually listened more than he spoke, not because he was ashamed, but because explaining took effort, and effort invited curiosity, and curiosity sometimes turned into judgment. Teachers asked questions too, mostly harmless ones. Who helps you with homework? Will your parents be able to attend the event? Can someone at home sign this? Marcus always answered politely, briefly, carefully. Yes. I'll check. I'll bring it back. Over time, he had learned how to exist within the margins of those conversations, present but not exposed. But Mr. Harris was the kind of teacher who liked context. He believed that understanding a student's background helped him teach better. And while that belief came from a place of professionalism, it sometimes led to conclusions he didn't realize he was making. As the lesson moved forward, Mr. Harris shifted into discussion mode. He enjoyed this part of teaching. It allowed him to see who was engaged, who was confident, who needed guidance. He asked questions that invited opinions, observations, interpretations. A few familiar voices answered. Marcus did not raise his hand. It wasn't that he didn't know the answers. Often he did. But experience had taught him something valuable. Speaking up changed how people looked at you. Sometimes it invited respect. Other times it invited scrutiny. And scrutiny, Marcus knew, had a way of sliding into places it didn't belong. So he listened. From time to time his thoughts drifted, never far, just enough to brush against memories of home. Home was quieter than people expected. Not lonely, not broken, just intentional. His father wasn't around much, at least not in the way teachers like to imagine fathers. There were no pickup trucks waiting after school, no loud cheers from the bleachers, no casual appearances at parent nights. But absence didn't mean emptiness. Marcus had grown up understanding that love didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrived in early morning messages. Sometimes it showed up in discipline, in standards, in
By the next morning, the classroom felt different to Marcus, though nothing about it had physically changed. The desks were in the same places, the posters still clung to the walls. The whiteboard waited, blank and patient. Even the light entering through the windows looked the same as it always had. And yet there was an underlying shift Marcus couldn't ignore. It wasn't anticipation, it was awareness sharpened into focus. He took his seat as usual, placing his notebook carefully on the desk, aligning it just enough to feel settled. Around him, students talked about homework, weekend plans, small frustrations that belonged to a world uncomplicated by caution. Their voices blended into a soft hum that filled the room. Mr. Harris arrived moments later, carrying a stack of papers tucked under his arm. "Good morning," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise. The room responded in unison. "Good morning." The lesson began. At first, everything followed the familiar rhythm. Mr. Harris reviewed assignments, made a few light jokes, corrected a mistake on the board. He moved confidently, comfortably, as someone who believed the room belonged to him. Then the conversation drifted, slowly, almost naturally, toward families. It wasn't planned, or at least it didn't feel planned. Mr. Harris was discussing accountability, how responsibility didn't start in the classroom but long before students ever arrived there. He spoke about structure, about guidance, about the role parents played in shaping discipline. Several students nodded. Marcus didn't. He kept his gaze steady on his notebook, pen resting but unmoving. He knew this territory. He had walked it many times before. Mr. Harris paused, scanning the room. "And of course," he continued, "having a strong father figure makes a difference. Someone who sets boundaries, someone who shows up." The words hung in the air longer than they should have. A few students shifted in their seats. Mr. Harris glanced down at his roster again, then back up. His eyes found Marcus, and this time they didn't move on so quickly. "Marcus," he said, his tone light, almost playful, "you've mentioned before that your dad isn't really around much, right?" The room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that follows an important question, but the kind that signals something delicate has just been touched. Marcus looked up slowly. "Yes, sir," he said. Mr. Harris tilted his head, as if considering something amusing. "So who signs your forms? Your mom, or does this mysterious dad make an appearance every now and then?" A few students chuckled. Not loudly, not cruelly, but enough. Enough to change the air in the room. Marcus felt it immediately. The heat in his chest didn't rise suddenly. It spread, slow and controlled. He didn't react outwardly. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He simply held still. Mr. Harris smiled, sensing the room's reaction. "I'm just saying," he added, waving a hand dismissively. "Sometimes students talk about parents who aren't really present. You know, stories, excuses." There it was, the word stories, as if truth were flexible, as if presence required visibility to count. A student near the back glanced at Marcus, then quickly looked away. Another leaned closer to a friend, whispering something too quiet to hear. Marcus heard nothing, and yet he heard everything. He was acutely aware of his posture, his breathing, the way his hands rested on the desk. He knew that every second mattered, that how he responded or didn't would define more than just this moment. Mr. Harris leaned back at his desk, arms crossed. "Don't take it personally, Marcus," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But sometimes kids exaggerate. Everyone wants their dad to be someone important." The room froze. That was the moment. The line wasn't just crossed, it was erased. Marcus felt the weight of every eye on him, not all of them curious, not all of them judgmental, but all of them waiting to see what he would do. He thought of the message on his phone. "I'll be there when it matters." He thought of mornings spent in silence, lessons learned without applause, standards enforced without excuses. He thought of the difference between power that speaks and power that doesn't need to. Marcus lifted his head. "No, sir," he said quietly. Mr. Harris blinked, surprised. "No?" "My dad isn't a story," Marcus continued. His voice was steady, calm. "He's just not someone who explains himself." The room stayed silent. For a brief moment, something flickered across Mr. Harris's face, uncertainty maybe, but it passed quickly, replaced by a smirk. "Well, I suppose we'll see." And just like that, the moment was dismissed. The lesson resumed. Mr. Harris turned back to the board, picking up the marker as if nothing had happened, as if the room hadn't shifted on its axis. But for Marcus, something had changed permanently. He returned his gaze to his notebook, though the words blurred. His heart beat slowly, deliberately. He wasn't angry. Anger would have been easier. What he felt instead was resolve. Because humiliation, when faced calmly, had a way of revealing more about the person delivering it than the one receiving it. The bell rang not long after. Students stood quickly, eager to escape the tension they didn't fully understand. Conversations resumed, louder now, exaggerated, forced. Some avoided looking at Marcus altogether. Mr. Harris gathered his papers, humming softly, entirely unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what he had just set into motion. Marcus waited until the room emptied before standing. As he walked past the desk, Mr. Harris spoke again. "Don't take it personally, Marcus," he said lightly. "It's just motivation." Marcus stopped. He turned slowly, meeting the teacher's eyes. "I won't," he replied, and for the first time, Mr. Harris felt it. Not fear, not guilt, but something colder. Uncertainty. Marcus left the room without another word. Down the hallway, the noise of the school swallowed him whole. Lockers slammed, shoes squeaked. Life moved forward, indifferent to what had just occurred. But somewhere beneath that noise, something had begun to shift, because the mockery had gone unnoticed, and soon, very soon, the truth would arrive. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a presence no one in that room would ever forget.
The days that followed moved forward as if nothing had happened. That, perhaps, was the most unsettling part. Room 214 returned to its routines. Lessons continued. Assignments were collected. Mr. Harris maintained the same measured tone, the same confident posture, the same belief that the moment had passed and been forgotten. To him, it was just another exchange. Poorly timed humor, perhaps, but harmless. A remark made in passing, already erased by the next lesson plan. But moments like that don't disappear. They settle. Marcus noticed the change immediately, not in Mr. Harris, but in the room itself. There were fewer glances now, less whispering. The kind of silence that followed wasn't neutral, it was cautious. His classmates didn't know what to do with what they had witnessed. Some avoided him entirely. Others offered polite smiles that felt more like apologies than greetings. No one asked him about his father. No one joked. No one laughed. And Marcus didn't bring it up. He carried himself the same way he always had, quiet, focused, contained. But inside he felt something steady forming, not bitterness, not resentment, certainty. He had crossed a threshold, and he knew it. At home, things were just as calm. Marcus sat at the kitchen table that evening, finishing his homework while the house remained still. The space around him felt deliberate, organized, intentional. There were no distractions, no raised voices, no chaos, just structure. His phone buzzed once. Another message. How was school? Marcus stared at the screen for a moment before replying, "Fine." The word felt accurate, not because nothing had happened, but because he understood that not everything needed to be explained. A moment later, another message arrived. "Event coming up. I'll handle it." Marcus read it twice. Then he placed the phone face down on the table and returned to his work. He trusted those words because he knew something Mr. Harris didn't. The next few days unfolded with careful normalcy. Mr. Harris remained professional, though subtly distant. He called on Marcus less, avoided direct commentary. It wasn't guilt, it was discomfort. The kind that comes when authority senses it may have misjudged someone, but isn't ready to admit it. Marcus didn't seek attention. He didn't need to. There was power in restraint, and he understood it better than most. During lunch one afternoon, a student from another class sat across from him, lowering his voice. "That was messed up," he said, referring to the comment. Marcus nodded once. "It happens." The student hesitated. "Your dad really, you know?" Marcus looked up calmly. "He's real." That was all. The conversation ended there. Rumors tried to form, but they never quite took shape. Without confirmation, speculation collapsed under its own weight. Marcus didn't correct anyone. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. And in doing so, he took something away from them: control. Meanwhile, preparations for the school event moved forward. Announcements crackled over the intercom, flyers appeared on bulletin boards. Teachers reminded students to dress appropriately, to behave professionally, to represent the school well. Administrators spoke about community, about excellence, about pride. Parents were invited. Special guests were expected. Mr. Harris mentioned it during class one morning, his tone more formal than usual. He said, "We'll have visitors, important ones. This is an opportunity to show respect." Marcus listened carefully. The word important landed differently now. As the day approached, a subtle tension settled into the building, not anxious, but anticipatory. Teachers straightened their classrooms, hallways were cleaned more thoroughly, schedules were adjusted. Mr. Harris, in particular, became meticulous. He reviewed lesson plans twice, corrected minor issues more sharply. He seemed eager to present himself as composed, competent, unquestionable. Marcus noticed. He also noticed how often Mr. Harris glanced toward the door now, as if measuring the distance between comfort and consequence. The morning of the event arrived quietly, too quietly. The sky outside was clear, the kind of clear that made everything feel exposed. Marcus arrived early as usual. He took his seat, placed his notebook down, and waited. His phone vibrated once. No message, just a signal. He didn't check it. Mr. Harris entered shortly after, dressed more formally than usual. His movements were deliberate, his voice crisp as he greeted the class. "Today's an important day. Let's make sure we're all focused." The lesson began, but it lacked its usual rhythm. Mr. Harris spoke faster, paused more often, corrected small mistakes with unnecessary precision. Marcus remained calm. He felt no rush, no nerves, just clarity. Because while the teacher controlled the room, someone else controlled what was coming. Halfway through the period, there was a knock at the door. Soft, controlled, not rushed. Mr. Harris stopped mid-sentence. The room went silent. He frowned slightly, irritation flickering across his face before he masked it with a professional smile. "Yes?" he called. The door opened, not fully, just enough for the school administrator to appear, posture rigid, expression serious. "Mr. Harris," she said, "we need to interrupt for a moment." That alone was unusual. Administrators didn't interrupt classes lightly, especially not during scheduled lessons. "Yes?" Mr. Harris asked, stepping forward. "We have a guest," she continued, "a high-ranking one. He's asked to observe." The word "asked" carried weight. Mr. Harris straightened instinctively. "Of course," he said. That's fine." The administrator nodded and stepped aside. And for a brief moment, nothing happened. The doorway stood open. The room waited. Marcus remained seated. Then, footsteps echoed in the hallway, measured, unhurried. Each step carried intention. The figure who entered didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. His presence did the work for him. The uniform was impeccable, not decorative, but authoritative, the kind worn by someone who didn't attend events often, but when he did, entire schedules shifted to accommodate it. Students froze. Mr. Harris's smile faltered. The man's gaze moved slowly across the room, not inspecting, not judging, but observing. He radiated control without effort, command without noise. When his eyes reached Marcus, something subtle changed. Not recognition, but respect. A single nod, barely perceptible, but unmistakable. Mr. Harris noticed it, and for the first time since the beginning of the year, uncertainty crept visibly into his posture. The administrator cleared her throat.
"Class," she said, "please welcome." The man raised a hand gently. "No need," he said calmly. "I'm here to observe." Silence followed, the kind that didn't belong to fear, but to understanding. Marcus sat perfectly still. Mr. Harris swallowed. Because in that moment, something became painfully clear. This wasn't a visit. This was a reckoning. And the truth Mr. Harris had dismissed as a story was now standing, very real, very present, inside his classroom. Without a word spoken between them, the balance of power shifted, and the teacher, for the first time, realized how little he actually knew.
The room didn't breathe. That was the strangest part. Not a cough, not a chair shifting, not the soft shuffle of feet against the floor. 30 students sat frozen in their seats, suspended in a moment that felt heavier than sound itself. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate, its ticking suddenly too loud, too intrusive. The man stood just inside the doorway, hands relaxed at his sides, posture effortless but immovable. He didn't scan the room again. He didn't speak. He simply existed there, present in a way that demanded recognition without asking for it. Mr. Harris stood at the front of the room, marker still in his hand. He hadn't realized he was holding his breath until his chest tightened. This wasn't how these visits usually went. There was supposed to be notice, a schedule, an introduction. Administrators usually hovered, smiling nervously, eager to demonstrate cooperation. None of that was happening. Instead, the administrator who had opened the door now stood slightly behind the man, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression carefully neutral. The man took one step forward, then another. Each movement was unhurried, deliberate, like time itself had slowed to accommodate him. His shoes made no sound against the floor, but the impact of his presence echoed anyway. He stopped near the front row. His gaze shifted briefly to Mr. Harris, not accusing, not forgiving, just aware. "Please," the man said calmly, "continue." Mr. Harris blinked. "Continue?" he repeated, his voice noticeably tighter than before. "Yes," the man replied. "I'd like to observe the class as it normally functions." Normally, the word landed hard. Mr. Harris nodded too quickly. "Of course," he said, turning back to the board. His hand shook just slightly as he uncapped the marker again. The lesson resumed, but only in form, not in spirit. Mr. Harris spoke, but the words came out differently now. He paused too often, repeated himself, lost his place mid-sentence and had to start over. His usual confidence had thinned, replaced by something brittle. The students noticed. They noticed the change in his voice, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he avoided looking at the man seated now in an empty desk near the back of the room. Yes, seated. The Supreme Commander had chosen a desk, a student's desk. He had lowered himself into it without comment, folding his large frame with practiced ease, as if hierarchy meant nothing to him in that moment. But everyone felt it. Marcus felt it most clearly of all. He hadn't moved since the man entered. His posture remained calm, his expression neutral. Only his breathing shifted slightly, steady, grounded. He felt no rush of triumph, no surge of relief, just alignment. This was how it was supposed to feel when truth arrived, not loud, not theatrical, but undeniable. The commander's attention drifted across the room, pausing on students, absorbing the environment. When his gaze returned to Marcus, it lingered a fraction longer this time, not to single him out, but to anchor him. Mr. Harris continued speaking, his earlier remarks about family and responsibility conspicuously absent now. He stuck rigidly to the curriculum, avoiding deviation, avoiding commentary, avoiding risk. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The tension did not fade. If anything, it deepened. Finally, the commander raised his hand. It was a small motion, controlled, but it carried immediate authority. Mr. Harris stopped mid-sentence. "Yes?" he asked too quickly again. The commander's voice was calm. "I have a question." "Of course," Mr. Harris said, clearing his throat. The commander gestured lightly toward the class. "You place a great deal of emphasis on structure, on accountability, on presence." Mr. Harris nodded. "Yes, I believe those are important." "So do I," the commander replied. He paused. The silence pressed in. "Tell me," he continued, "how do you define presence?" The question was simple, but it wasn't harmless. Mr. Harris opened his mouth and closed it again. He smiled thinly. "Well," he said, "being present means showing up, being involved, supporting students directly." The commander nodded slowly. "Physically?" Mr. Harris hesitated. "Yes, physically." A subtle shift moved through the room. The commander leaned back slightly in his seat. "Interesting," he said. "So presence is measured by visibility." Mr. Harris felt his pulse in his ears. "I would say yes, in many cases." The commander turned his head just slightly. His eyes found Marcus. Then, without looking away, he spoke. "My son disagrees." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. The room went perfectly still. Mr. Harris felt the floor drop out from beneath him. "Your son?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The commander finally turned fully toward Marcus. "Marcus," he said evenly. Marcus looked up. "Yes, sir." The respect in his voice wasn't performative, it was natural. The commander nodded. "Would you stand, please?" Marcus rose slowly, calmly, pushing his chair back without sound. He stood tall, not defiant, not proud, just present. Every eye in the room locked onto him. Mr. Harris couldn't look away. The commander addressed the class now. "This young man," he said, "was raised to understand discipline without cruelty, structure without humiliation, strength without noise." He paused, letting the words settle. "I've been with him every step of the way, even when my work required distance, even when visibility was impossible." Mr. Harris's face had gone pale. The commander stood. When he did, the room seemed to shrink. He stepped forward until he stood beside Marcus. "I am his father, and I am very real." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was absolute. Mr. Harris's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The commander turned toward Mr. Harris. "You assumed absence. You mistook restraint for fiction, and you used your authority to humiliate." His voice never rose. That was the worst part. "I don't raise my son to respond to mockery. I raise him to let truth speak when the moment arrives." He gestured lightly to the room. "This," he said, "is that moment." Mr. Harris swallowed hard. His marker slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the floor. No one moved to pick it up. The commander looked at Marcus again. "You may sit." Marcus did. The commander turned back to Mr. Harris. "Class dismissed," he said simply. The bell rang a second later, perfectly on time. But no one stood right away, because they all understood something now. The power in that room had never belonged to mockery, and it never would again.
The bell's echo faded, but no one moved. It wasn't confusion that held the room in place. It was recalibration. 30 students sat with the sudden awareness that something irreversible had just happened. Not a scene, not a spectacle, a correction. The kind that rearranges how people understand authority. Mr. Harris stood frozen at the front of the room, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the whiteboard, as if searching for a version of the morning that no longer existed. His marker lay on the floor near his feet, a small, ordinary object that now felt strangely symbolic. He did not bend to pick it up. The Supreme Commander turned toward the administrator.
A brief nod passed between them, no words exchanged, none required. She stepped forward, clearing her throat. "Students," she said gently, "you're dismissed." Chairs slid back slowly this time. Backpacks were lifted with care. The room emptied in a hush, conversations suspended, as if everyone had silently agreed to carry this moment elsewhere before speaking about it. Marcus stood last. He always did. As he gathered his things, he felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not pride, not relief, something quieter, something steadier. Recognition. He didn't look at Mr. Harris as he passed the desk. He didn't need to. The imbalance had already corrected itself. Attention would have been unnecessary and undeserved. Out in the hallway, the world resumed its noise. Lockers slammed, voices overlapped, but the usual chaos felt distant, like sound heard through water. Students looked at Marcus differently now, not with curiosity, not with pity, with respect. A few nodded as he walked by. One murmured, "That was wow." Another simply stepped aside to let him pass. Marcus acknowledged none of it. He moved forward at his own pace, breathing evenly. Down the hall, the commander walked beside him. They didn't speak right away. They didn't need to. It was only when they reached a quieter corridor that the commander broke the silence. "You handled yourself well," he said. Marcus nodded. "I said to wait." The commander's expression softened just slightly. "You listened." They continued walking. Behind them, in room 214, the administrator spoke quietly with Mr. Harris. The tone was calm, professional, final. There were no raised voices, no accusations hurled, just facts stated plainly. What was said mattered less than what was understood. By the end of the conversation, Mr. Harris's shoulders had sagged, not from punishment, but from realization, the kind that doesn't bruise the ego so much as dismantle it. That afternoon, students whispered. Stories traveled quickly, edited, embellished, softened. Some said the teacher had been put in his place. Others said it was about respect. A few tried to reduce it to a dramatic reveal. Marcus ignored all of it. At home, he placed his backpack down, washed his hands, and sat at the table as he always did. The house was quiet, intentional, familiar. The commander joined him a few minutes later, setting his phone aside. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked. Marcus thought for a moment. "No," he said. "I think it said what it needed to." The commander nodded. "Good." They ate in silence, not uncomfortable, not heavy, just present. Later that evening, a message arrived from the school. Formal language, polite phrasing, an acknowledgement of an incident, assurances of review, commitments to appropriate action. Marcus read it once, then deleted it. The next day, room 214 felt different. Mr. Harris was not there. A substitute stood at the front of the room, voice unsure, posture tentative. The lesson proceeded carefully, almost apologetically. No one joked, no one tested boundaries. Marcus took his seat and opened his notebook. He felt no urge to speak, no need to explain. The silence he had chosen before now worked in his favor, reframed not as absence, but as composure. At lunch, a teacher from another class approached him. "Your father seems impressive," she said, attempting a smile. Marcus returned a polite nod. "He just shows up." She paused, then nodded, as if realizing the depth of that statement too late. Days passed. Whispers faded. The story lost its urgency, as stories do when they no longer serve gossip. But something remained. Mr. Harris returned the following week, not to room 214, but to a different role, administrative duties, no classroom of his own. The change wasn't announced. It didn't need to be. He avoided Marcus in the halls, not from fear, from understanding. Once they crossed paths near the main office. Mr. Harris stopped.
"Marcus," he said, quietly. Marcus paused. "I owe you an apology," he continued. "I crossed a line." Marcus listened. He said nothing. "I mistook authority for entitlement and silence for absence." Marcus nodded once. "I accept." It wasn't forgiveness. It was closure. Mr. Harris stepped aside, letting him pass. That night, Marcus received another message, "Proud of you." He replied this time, "Thank you for waiting." The commander read it and smiled. Weeks later, the school held another event, another assembly, another set of speeches about respect and values. Marcus sat among his peers, listening, observing. Nothing extraordinary happened, and that was the point. Justice, when done correctly, doesn't echo forever. It corrects the course and then gets out of the way. Marcus stood a little taller now, not because he had been defended, but because he had been trusted to endure. He understood something his classmates were only beginning to learn: that dignity doesn't demand recognition, that truth doesn't rush, and that silence, chosen carefully, can be the strongest voice in the room. The moment had passed, but the lesson remained. Quiet, unmistakable, and permanent.
Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges. Weeks passed, then months, and what once felt seismic slowly settled into memory. The hallway no longer carried whispers. The classroom no longer felt charged. New routines replaced old ones, and the school returned to the comforting illusion that everything was as it had always been. But Marcus knew better. Because moments like that don't disappear, they integrate. They become reference points, quiet markers in time that shape how you walk forward, how you speak, how you choose silence or sound. From the outside, nothing about Marcus seemed different. He still arrived early, still chose the same seat, still listened more than he spoke. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. Not confidence, clarity. He no longer wondered how he would be seen. He understood who he was, regardless of perception. That understanding brought a calm that didn't rely on approval. At school, authority began to feel different too. Teachers spoke more carefully. Questions were asked with intention instead of assumption. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't perfect, but it was noticeable. Respect had become conscious, and that mattered. Marcus never told the story himself. When people asked, he redirected the conversation. When classmates hinted at it, he smiled politely and moved on. He understood something most people never learn. Power doesn't need to relive its victories. It moves forward. At home, nothing changed, and that too mattered. The commander never spoke of the day unless Marcus did. There were no speeches, no lessons spelled out, just the same structure, the same standards, the same quiet presence that had always been there. One evening, as they sat together in comfortable silence, Marcus finally asked, "Why didn't you tell them who you were sooner?" The commander didn't answer right away. "Because," he said finally, "if respect only arrives after titles are revealed, then it was never respect to begin with." Marcus absorbed that. It explained everything: the teacher, the classroom, the silence, the timing. Truth, when rushed, becomes noise. Truth, when waited for, becomes undeniable. What happened in room 214 wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about authority being challenged. It was about assumption meeting reality. It was about how easily power slips into cruelty when it forgets humility, and how quickly cruelty collapses when faced with quiet truth. The teacher believed presence required visibility. The students believed silence meant weakness. The system believed authority went unquestioned. All three were wrong. Marcus learned that day that dignity doesn't shout, it stands. He learned that restraint is not submission, it's preparation. And most importantly, he learned that you don't owe the world explanations it hasn't earned. Years later, the memory would return to him in unexpected times, in meetings, in conversations, in moments where someone underestimated him because they mistook calm for compliance. Each time, he would smile internally and wait, because he understood now that the strongest responses are often delayed, not because they are uncertain, but because they are precise. Some lessons arrive in noise. Others arrive in silence so complete it forces everyone to listen. That day in the classroom was one of those lessons, not for Marcus alone, but for anyone who witnessed the moment authority froze, not from fear, but from recognition. Recognition that power, when misused, exposes itself. Recognition that truth does not chase validation. Recognition that the people you underestimate often carry the deepest strength. And recognition that silence, chosen, disciplined, intentional silence, can change the balance of a room without ever raising its voice. Marcus would carry that lesson forward long after the desks were replaced, the posters taken down, and the names forgotten. Because some moments aren't meant to be remembered loudly. They're meant to shape you quietly. And once they do, you never walk into a room the same way again.